This video is an entry for the tip of the week, and this is something that I have been seeing in my basic students, and that is how to make left slanting decreases. And this comes up frequently because it is very difficult to make a left slanting decrease to match a right slanting decrease. These are knit two togethers, and it's just a very nice, neat decrease. But when it comes to mirroring it, it can be difficult. Now, I've done a variety of decreases here. This decrease is an SSK, where you slip the two stitches knitwise, and then you work them through the back, and it produces a left slanting decrease. And it is generally the one that you use to match a knit two together. And I want you to notice, if I spread apart that second stitch underneath in the decrease, notice that it is open at the bottom. In order for a decrease to mirror, it must be the same type, and by that I mean twisted or untwisted, and they must slant in opposite directions. Now if we look at the SSK, notice that that second stitch is not twisted. It matches the knit two together. So it ticks all of the boxes. The problem is making it small. And basically I've learned that if you make it by just babying the stitches when you slip them, then it doesn't stretch it out, it stays pretty much the same size. Now, by the way, I use much larger needles than I would have for this because I want you to see twisted stitches. Now, this one I made the same way, except instead of slipping the stitches on right before I want to make the decrease, I worked the stitches on the wrong side at that location by wrapping it underneath. And what that does, underneath the needle rather than over the needle on the purl side. And what that does is it orients those stitches so that they don't need to be slipped on the next row. And it gives you pretty much the same result. Now, one of the things that my students in the basics class have been pointing out, and they think they've discovered something new and unusual, is a way to make that decrease smaller. And if you Google in YouTube, smaller SSK decreases, invariably one of these two methods are going to come up. In this one, what you do is actually I worked one where you didn't twist them, you just worked them through the back, and what you get is twisted on both sides. Now what I want you to see is notice that the top stitch is not open, like that one, and the second one is not open, it's twisted. And they don't match the SSKs. They're smaller and tighter, yeah, but they don't match. Now, the one that I've been seeing a lot of lately, my students, is one of two methods. And in this method, and I'll demo this in a minute, you slip just the top stitch knitwise, then you work the other stitch, and the problem with it is that it twists that under stitch, and it does not match the the knit two together on the other side. If you look at this knit two together, it's open. If you look at this one, it is twisted. And is it a big deal? Well, it depends on how you feel about things matching. I think it's asymmetrical, and I notice it. Now, this one is one where you work the stitch, and this is the one where I've been sent videos at least on 4 occasions for this guy from different people that are doing it. And you work it through the knitwise, and then you insert it through the back and you work it. It's easier to show than describe, and it has the same flaw in that it twists that second stitch. And I don't really see any difference between it and slipping the first stitch and then not slipping the second one. So I just want to show you a couple of ways to make these decreases. So I'm going to go ahead and knit a few stitches, and again I apologize, I'm getting used to my new system here, and I'm not knitting quite as smoothly. So if I want to make an SSK, I slip the first stitch, I slip the second stitch, and what that does is it alters their position on the needle so that I can then work them through the back and I get an SSK. Now notice I did two things when I did that. Let me go back, and of course now I'll stretch it out. Is when I slip them, I just barely touch them. I'm using my needle tips. And then I leave them on the needle. I don't slip them. I just insert my needle in front of it, and that's the same as knitting it through the back. And then I work the stitch, but I am at a funny angle for this. So there we go. All right, so there's the SSK. Now, what people will recommend for doing it smaller is this. You slip the first stitch, you put it on the needle, but you don't slip that second stitch, and then I get a supposedly smaller SSK, but that secondary stitch is twisted. You can see it right there. Now, the problem is that twisted stitches are different than open stitches, and a twisted stitch is always going to be smaller than a regular stitch, so naturally the resulting SSK is going to look from a distance like it's smaller, but when you look close you can see that it's not. Now, the way that I've been sent this video several times and is that you knit it through the front, you insert it through the second stitch on the back, and notice how I'm kind of twisting this guy, and then I pull it through, and that gives you a so-called smaller SSK. And actually, I don't think it is. I think that if you're going to want a twisted decrease, you may as well just slip the first stitch and then not slip the second stitch, because I don't think that's all that small. But one thing that you'll notice, and I want to show you one more thing, so I'm going to work to the end here and purl back. One thing you'll notice in a lot of these videos is when they're discussing decreases is that they really don't mention twisted stitches all that much at all. And I don't know whether to the world outside of master knitters that it's all that important, but in the master's program, twisted stitches, we do make a fuss about them. So you want to avoid a method, that creates twisted stitches. Now, in your own project, who cares? If the twisted stitch underneath doesn't bother you, fine, go ahead and use it. But for your master's work and for the basics class, because we're teaching you now the best techniques. Oh, and I was so busy talking, I forgot to do what I was going to do. Don't do it. Use a standard method, and you can use the way that I just showed you, which by babying the stitches and barely using your needles, which leaves it pretty small. And you could try this. Now, notice I'm on the wrong side, and on the right side, I know I'm going to decrease these two stitches. So if I work them, instead of going over, I go under. That's twisting them on the needle. Now, you don't want to do that too tight, because if you do it too tight, then your decrease is going to look pinched, which isn't an improvement. So when I get to my right side, if I do this, instead of having to slip them, they're already twisted on my needle. I can just insert in here, and I can work them. And actually, that's a fairly nice looking decrease right there. It's fairly small. Now, the other thing that you can do, remember, is that when you have decreases, and again, these have been worked in a large needle and I've been playing with them, but if you have something that looks like this, where you've got your nice line here and this looks messy, you can always use a tapestry needle and work excess yarn over to the selvage stitch, because that selvage stitch will be encased in a band or a seam, and so it's not going to be that noticeable. I will post this photo cleaned up, blocked, in my blog entry that accompanies this video, so you can check it out. But again, if you're a basic student or you're a master's student, you do not want to use a decrease that's going to twist the second stitch or the top stitch. It just doesn't match, and it looks kind of sloppy.